Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. On behalf of our director, Mr. Gary Gillette, and members of your Missoula City Band, this is Bill Rhodes saying welcome to tonight's performance. Gary has outdone himself in programming this concert. We have not one, but two soloists. In addition, we have not one, but two works by Missoula's favorite composer, George Rosencrantz. Take it from me, you can't buy a ticket like this even in New York City. Let's get things rolling, Mr. Gillette. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join us now as we honor our nation with the playing of our national anthem. Well, we have a couple of announcements tonight. There's a gentleman from Public Broadcasting. Where is this gentleman? There they are. See him waving? Anyway, he needs your help. Here's a chance to be part of a television documentary being filmed right here in Missoula. The program is about a 1904 basketball team, and KUFM TV is looking for people to be in a cheering crowd. In other words, you'd be an extra. Costumes would be provided, and dinner is also provided that evening. If you are interested, see the all right. Gary signed up. If you are interested, see the KUFM staff members with the flyers for more information, and they're right up. Just raise your hand, folks, and they'll come out and give you the flyer information. Great opportunity. Who knows? You may be the next Cary Grant or Lauren Bacall.
Here you go. I'll take a couple up there.
Do you need a band to play this basketball? Now, I have a special announcement this evening. I'd like to mention that in the audience are represented some very special people to me. They're my co-workers from Job Service. Where are you folks? Make some noise, Job Service members. There they are. They're right back there, right over there, folks. All right. Let's dedicate this next number, a fine Spanish march to the Job Service. This is Amparito Roco by Jaime Tejedor. Next up is a number new to us. This is the Too Long Overture. No, that's not right. Make that too long, as in the French Seaport Overture. The Too Long Overture is something completely different. We did that one year. It started at 8 o'clock and went past 9:30. We won't do that again. The Too Long Overture is by Gabriel Pares. He is often called the John Philip Sousa of France. For many years at the turn of the century, he was the director of the famous Paris Republican Guards Band, one of the finest bands in the world at the time. Written about 1912, here's his salute to the French Navy based at the city of Toulon. We're going to ask our Band 8 folks to circulate amongst you. Your generosity in support of our organization is always outstanding. A contribution is always strictly voluntary. On behalf of us band folks, thank you all so much. They're going to be circulating among you now before the next number. We're in for a real treat now. Violinist Miss Annalies Taylor is one of tonight's guest artists. She's originally from the Netherlands and since 2000 has made her home in Missoula with her husband Sam and daughter Alyssa. She studied violin in Holland and Switzerland. She is the principal violinist with the Butte and Helena Symphonies. She would like to thank Gary for inviting her to play with us and cellist Ken Grant for his help with preparations. She would also like to dedicate this performance to the memory of her mother-in-law, Mary Taylor, who died unexpectedly this spring. This evening, she's playing Henri Volta's Reverie. Please give a warm city band welcome to the talented and very nice Miss Annalies Taylor. Miss Annalies Taylor. That was just wonderful, and what a finish. We've got wind. All right, it's time for a George Rosencrantz march. This is a rare piece of Mr. Rosencrantz' work, as it was one of the few of his pieces that was never published. I suspect it was one of his later works, written sometime in the 1940s, a real toe tapper by the city band's favorite composer. This is Flag of America March by George Rosencrantz. Our next number is a rhapsody. A rhapsody in music is a one-movement work that is episodic, yet free-flowing in nature, featuring a range of highly contrasted moods, color, and tonality. Oftentimes named for a nationality, famous rhapsodies include Hungarian Rhapsody, Romanian Rhapsody, Spanish, and American. Our next piece, that having been said, our next piece was written in 1950 and based on Swedish folk tunes. Here now is the first Swedish Rhapsody by Eric Leidzén. The Peckhorn's Revenge. While important to the music, it's not necessarily a lot of fun to play. Now with this piece, there is some narration, so I'm going to pretend to be a French horn player and enlighten you as to the woes of being a Peckhorn player. I am a Peckhorn player, and this is my story. You never heard of a Peckhorn? Well, let me just show you what I mean. Just listen. Sounds good, doesn't it? But now let's break that down into sections and see what the individual bandsmen were playing. First, the brass and percussion. And now, the woodwinds. And now, the Peckhorns. This then is my story, a tragedy in afterbeats. I have always liked band music, and just as soon as I was old enough, I went to see the band director to sign up for beginning band. I didn't care what I played, just anything, as long as I could take part in that beautiful music. The band director told me he'd adjust the instrument for me, the most beautiful of all brasses, the French horn. When I went home and told my parents, they became enthusiastic too. So they mortgaged our home and bought my horn. $479 plus case plus tax. This is an old piece, folks. It's a lot more expensive than that now. And in the beginning band, I got my first acquaintance with beautiful music. Okay, I lied about the beautiful part. After a few years of playing afterbeats in the beginning band, I began to look forward to the day when I could get into the junior band and play some real music. I practiced an hour every day and studied privately with Mr. Potoff, the great hornist. He charged me $7.50 per lesson and had me buy all his published works. But I never flinched, and at last, I got into the junior band. 3 years, 3 long years of playing afterbeats in the junior band. My impatience was tempered a bit by my band leader's assurance that when I got to high school, there a real symphonic music was used. My beautiful French horn would really come into its own. Senior band, I'll never forget that first rehearsal. As I scanned the first number, my spirit soared. There, right in the middle of the page, it said in big letters, solo! A solo! At last, my long years of study and practice were going to be rewarded. At last, I was going to have a solo. As we started the piece, my heart was filled with pride in anticipation of the solo to come. Rapidly, we neared the fateful mark. A one-note solo. 8 years I waited and studied and practiced, and then I get a one-note solo, one lousy note, and then oompa oompa. They can't do this to me. I'll organize a resistance movement among all horn players, and we'll revolt. We'll infiltrate into all the offices of the Musicians Union. We'll boycott the music publishers. We'll kidnap Gillette. We'll dominate the entire music industry. And then the Peckhorns' revenge. No more afterbeats. I think we might change the title of that, Gary, to The Director's Revenge Against the Announcer. Anyway. Let's see. Next on deck. Oh, we've got our next soloist, Miss Allie Beatty. She's coming up on stage now. Allie has just graduated from Sentinel High School this year. She studied clarinet under our own Gary Gillette. What a player she is. Her immediate plans are to attend the University of Montana and study clarinet performance and vocal music education. And we're sure she'll knock their socks off over there. A family affair here in the city band. Her dad, Ross, is one of our Peckhorn players. Say hello, Ross. Allie's going to play the clarinet polka. I'm sure you've heard that. Please now welcome Miss Allie Beatty. Thank you, Allie. Great job. Our next march is by Russell Alexander. He was an entertainer and composer, acted primarily with vaudeville shows and musical comedy organizations at the turn of the century. At 20, this is how talented he was. At 20, he became a ranger and euphonium soloist with the Barnum and Bailey Circus Band. No small feat there. Tragically, he died of tuberculosis in 1915 at the age of 38. Although his compositional output is relatively small, he is considered a great composer of marches. Here is one of his finest efforts from 1908. This is called The Southerner. Well, we're going to go from the circus tent to the dance hall, dance room, ballroom hall. The Begin is a dance similar to a slow rumba that was popular in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Tonight we'd like to play Begin Festival based on the tunes For Sentimental Reason and I'll Remember April. This is by Glenn Osser. It's Begin Festival.
And featuring on maracas, Dean Pod, whose daddy taught him to play the maracas for Beguines.
Well, we're coming up on our last piece tonight. On behalf of Gary and our band members, this is Bill Rhodes saying thank you to our guest artists, Miss Annalies Aiken-Taylor and Miss Allie Beatty. Now to finish, as promised, we will feature our trombone section in George Rosencrans' Trombone Smear March Slurioso. Good night, everyone.